Do you keep in contact with the Beach Boys at all?
Not at all. No, I don't like Mike Love at all. No.
Brian Wilson is dead, and for 26 hours, Mike Love said nothing. When he finally did, no one saw it coming. It was just past 8 a.m. on June 11, 2025, when the headlines began to roll in. Legendary Beach Boys founder Brian Wilson has passed away. Across newsrooms, social feeds, and streaming networks, the tributes were swift. Elton John called him a one-of-a-kind melody architect. Bob Dylan reportedly wept during an impromptu rehearsal. Nancy Sinatra tweeted a single word: devastated. The world responded with instant reverence. Fans flooded comment sections with memories, lyrics, and tears. But amid the chorus of praise, one voice was noticeably absent. Mike Love, the man who sang beside Wilson for decades, the co-founder of the Beach Boys, the cousin who had been there from the very beginning, said absolutely nothing. Not a word, not a whisper. And for 26 long hours, the silence spoke louder than any tribute. Speculation ignited. Was it bitterness, avoidance, or just grief too deep to process? Then, on the morning of June 12th, something changed. A quiet Instagram post appeared on Mike Love's official account. Black and white, no filter. Just an old photograph of two boys, Mike and Brian, leaning on each other outside a Capitol Studios session in 1965. The caption read, "Death leaves a heartache no one can heal. Love leaves a memory no one can steal." For many, it was the first sign of real emotion from a man who had spent much of his public life deflecting questions, dodging blame, and defending legacy. But that post wasn't the end. A few hours later, a 94-second video was quietly released by Love's communication team. Dressed in a dark suit, holding that same photograph, Mike Love spoke with an unfamiliar stillness in his voice. "We didn't always agree, but what we created together is undeniable. I didn't just lose a colleague, I lost a brother." The world watched in silence. For the first time in decades, Love wasn't correcting the record, he was sharing a memory. And whether it was genuine grief or a calculated farewell, it shattered the decades-long wall of tension that had defined their story. But that wall wasn't built overnight. To understand what made Mike Love go quiet for 26 hours, you have to go back more than 60 years. Before the lawsuits, the bitterness, and the silence, there were just two boys from Hawthorne, California. Mike Love and Brian Wilson weren't just bandmates, they were blood relatives, cousins who grew up a few blocks apart, raised on transistor radios and the soothing swell of vocal harmonies pouring out of car speakers. In the early 1960s, music was their common language, and surf culture was their canvas. Brian, already a budding composer with a gift for layering melodies in his head, teamed up with Mike, whose charisma and lyrical instincts would help shape their earliest hits. Together with Brian's brothers, Dennis and Carl, and friend Al Jardine, they formed the Beach Boys. Their songs were electric, sun-drenched anthems like Surfin' USA, Fun Fun Fun, and I Get Around. Brian handled the arrangements, the studio magic, the musical muscle. Mike brought the hooks, the attitude, and the showmanship. The formula was simple: bright pop harmonies plus beach mythology equals pure American gold. But what the public didn't see was what simmered beneath the harmonies. Even in the band's earliest days, the differences between Brian and Mike were impossible to ignore. Brian was a perfectionist, obsessive, experimental, prone to retreating into his own head to chase a sound only he could hear. Mike was the pragmatist, the one who kept an eye on the charts, the money, the crowd. One was chasing artistic immortality, the other, commercial survival. And for a while, they coexisted. In small recording studios across LA, the cousins created a new sound, the California sound, a bright, hopeful, wide-eyed version of youth itself. Brian built the walls of sound, Mike gave those walls a front door. "He wrote the music, I wrote the lyrics," Mike once said. "He was the genius, but I made sure people actually heard it." But beneath the smiles and harmonies, the seeds of division had already been planted. And the moment Brian's ambition outgrew the band's radio-ready image, those seeds would grow into something no harmony could fix. In 1966, the Beach Boys released an album that would go on to change music history, but it nearly tore the band apart in the process. That album was Pet Sounds, a deeply personal, sonically ambitious project helmed almost entirely by Brian Wilson. At just 23, Wilson had stepped away from touring to focus on the studio, chasing a sound that no surf anthem could contain. He brought in orchestras, he layered harmonies, he wrote about heartbreak, alienation, and fragile innocence. It was a masterpiece. Critics hailed it as a landmark in American pop music. The Beatles themselves admitted it reshaped their creative vision, inspiring Sgt. Pepper's just a year later. But not everyone was applauding. Inside the band, Mike Love was growing uneasy. For years, the Beach Boys had ridden a wave of chart-topping hits, sunny, energetic, and radio-friendly. But Pet Sounds was something else. It was slower, more cerebral, less about the beach and more about the soul. According to music historians, Love reportedly questioned the direction of the album, fearing it might alienate the group's loyal fan base. And then came a phrase that would haunt him for decades. Don't mess with the formula. It was a warning, a plea, maybe even a power move. Whether or not Mike ever actually said those exact words, they became symbolic, etched into Beach Boys lore as the moment when art clashed with commerce and where a crack in the foundation turned into a visible fracture. As Brian poured himself into his next project, an even more avant-garde album called Smile, Mike's discomfort grew louder. He wasn't just worried about marketability anymore. He was worried about Brian's mental state. By the end of 1967, the Smile project had collapsed. Brian spiraled, the album was shelved, and the momentum of the band, once unstoppable, began to stall. What had started as a creative disagreement had become something far more personal. Brian was retreating into isolation. Mike was fighting to keep the machine running. And for the first time, it was clear. They weren't building the Beach Boys together anymore. They were pulling it in opposite directions. By the 1990s, the creative differences between Mike Love and Brian Wilson had evolved into something more than artistic tension. They had become a legal battlefield. In 1992, Mike Love did something that shocked longtime fans and cemented his reputation as the antagonist in the Beach Boys saga. He sued Brian Wilson. The claim? That Love had co-written 35 of the band's most iconic songs, including hits like California Girls and Help Me Rhonda, but had never been properly credited. The reason, according to Love, dated back decades. Murray Wilson, Brian's father and the band's early manager, had allegedly excluded him from the songwriting credits. Love insisted it wasn't about greed. He told reporters at the time, "This is about recognition. I wrote the lyrics. I was in the room. I deserve credit." But the optics told a different story. Brian Wilson, by then deep into years of mental health struggles, appeared vulnerable, almost detached from the drama. He wasn't just a creative force anymore. He was a fragile figure protected by therapists, lawyers, and handlers. Love, meanwhile, came across as calculating, angry, and opportunistic. The case went to court, the proceedings were messy, and in the end, Mike Love won. The judge ruled in his favor, awarding him over $13 million in damages and formally adding his name to the copyright records of dozens of Beach Boys classics. Legally, it was a landmark decision. Emotionally, it was a public reckoning. Music critics called it a betrayal. Fans flooded fan pages and message boards, calling him everything from a lyrical leech to the man who cashed in on a broken genius. Whether justified or not, the lawsuit permanently fractured the image of the band. Brian Wilson became a tragic hero. Mike Love became the villain. From that moment on, the story of the Beach Boys was no longer just about music. It was about ownership, about image, about legacy. And for two men who once harmonized side by side, the courtroom had become a place where no melody could survive. By the late 1990s, the Beach Boys were no longer a band. They were a brand, fractured, contested, and split down the middle. In 1998,
Carl Wilson, Brian's younger brother and a rare neutral force in the group, died after a battle with cancer. His passing marked more than just a personal loss. It was the final fracture that split the group into two irreconcilable halves. On one side, Mike Love, who held the legal rights to the band's name, continued touring with his version of the Beach Boys. He played the hits, booked the venues, and kept the show on the road. On the other, Brian Wilson, working under his own name, began performing selectively with old allies like Al Jardine and David Marks. These weren't reunions. They were rescue missions for a legacy, an attempt to show that the heart of the band wasn't lost in nostalgia. The result was confusion. Two Beach Boys, two legacies, one name. Then came 2012. Against all odds, the surviving members reunited for a 50th anniversary tour. For a moment, it felt like history might heal itself. They released a new album, That's Why God Made the Radio, and fans across the country saw something they hadn't in decades: Brian and Mike side by side. But it didn't last. Shortly after the final performance, Mike Love announced he would continue touring without Brian, Al, or David. He was criticized for allegedly firing Brian Wilson just weeks after their celebrated comeback. Love denied it. He claimed it had all been agreed upon in advance, that the contracts were clear, that he was only fulfilling obligations. But perception is powerful, and the perception was this: Mike Love had once again shut the door just as it was reopening. The headlines weren't kind. Fans accused him of ego, of sabotage, of squeezing the brand dry while keeping the soul out of reach. And then, in 2020, things got even more complicated. Mike Love performed at a fundraiser for Donald Trump's re-election campaign, using the Beach Boys name. Almost immediately, Brian Wilson and Al Jardine issued a joint statement. "We had nothing to do with this event and do not support the use of the band's name for political purposes." Suddenly, the divide wasn't just artistic, it was ideological. The Beach Boys weren't just separated, they were on the opposite sides of America's cultural fault line. The harmony was gone, but the tension, that was louder than ever. In the final years of Brian Wilson's life, the stage lights dimmed and the legal spotlight took over. By early 2024, Brian's health had begun to deteriorate rapidly. After the death of his longtime wife and caretaker, Melinda Ledbetter, who had fiercely shielded him from industry manipulation and personal collapse, alarm bells began ringing within his inner circle. In February 2024, a Los Angeles court placed Brian Wilson under a legal conservatorship, citing major neurocognitive decline. For fans, it was a sobering reminder. The genius who once layered vocal harmonies with surgical precision could now barely remember what year it was. But the court's decision sparked more than sympathy. It ignited a storm of speculation. Who would make decisions now? Who would control Brian's unreleased music, his likeness, his name? Would his legacy be handled by family or by business associates? As the Beach Boys brand remained active, a deeper, quieter battle loomed in the background. Was Brian Wilson now more of a product than a person? Fans voiced concern across social media. Longtime music journalists questioned whether Brian's posthumous releases were being strategically cued not for tribute, but for profit. There were whispers that managers were already combing through his archives, eyeing the vaults for unreleased tracks, demos, and marketable memorabilia. One such relic was already making headlines. In mid-2025, news broke that Cows in the Pasture, a long-lost 1970 country album Wilson recorded as a side project with singer Fred Vale, was being prepped for commercial release. The timing, just months before his death, felt haunting. The unfinished album, once dismissed as a quirky footnote in his career, now seemed like part of a farewell. For a man who had spent much of his life being controlled, misunderstood, and underestimated, the idea that his final years were being negotiated in boardrooms struck a nerve. And all the while, Mike Love remained on tour, performing the hits, filling the venues, and speaking sparingly about Brian, but never fully stepping out of the shadows cast by their shared history. Brian's world was shrinking, his memories were slipping, and his voice, once the soul of a generation, was going quiet. But even as the light faded, one thing remained certain. The silence from Mike Love wouldn't last forever.
June 12, 2025, 8 a.m. Pacific Time. A single post appeared on Mike Love's official social media accounts. It featured a black and white photo, two boys in their teens, leaning into each other in front of Capitol Studios. One of them was Brian Wilson, the other was Mike Love. The caption, brief and poetic, read, "Death leaves a heartache no one can heal. Love leaves a memory no one can steal." After 26 hours of silence following the news of Brian Wilson's death, Mike Love had finally spoken, and the world paused to listen. But this was only the beginning. Later that morning, a 94-second video quietly surfaced, produced and distributed by Love's communications team. It showed the 84-year-old singer seated alone in a dimly lit space. No music, no filters, just his voice, low, calm, and steady. In his hand, a worn photo from 1965. In his lap, the weight of 6 decades. He said, "We didn't always agree, but what we created together is undeniable. I didn't just lose a colleague, I lost a brother." It was the most personal Mike Love had ever sounded. There was no defensiveness, no historical correction, just grief. Within hours, major media outlets picked up the video. Variety, NPR, The Guardian, all quoted it directly in their tribute coverage of Brian Wilson. Some music critics, long skeptical of Love's intentions, admitted that, for once, he had said the right thing at the right time. It was, in their words, a necessary break in the silence. But the reaction online wasn't unanimous. On one side, fans praised Love's courage to finally speak openly, to lower his guard and to honor the man with whom he had shared the stage, the studio, and a stormy legacy. On the other, there was resentment. One viral comment summed up the frustration. Brian was alone at the end. Mike only spoke up when there was no one left to challenge him. Still, even critics acknowledged the moment's gravity. Unlike previous interviews, where Mike often used airtime to defend his role in the band's story or deflect blame, this statement contained no justification, no historical footnotes, no "I told you so." Just Brian. It marked the first and perhaps only time Mike Love allowed the spotlight to stay on his cousin, uninterrupted. And in that silence, amid all the years of noise, something quietly profound happened. Mike Love, the man cast for decades as the villain of the Beach Boys, had spoken not as a bandmate, a businessman, or a brand, but as a witness, a mourner, a memory keeper. With Brian Wilson gone and no reunion left to imagine, the story of the Beach Boys enters a new, uncertain chapter, one defined not by creation, but by preservation. At 84 years old, Mike Love remains the last surviving founding member of the band. Dennis Wilson drowned in 1983. Carl Wilson lost his battle with cancer in 1998. And now, in June 2025, Brian, composer, visionary, and reluctant icon, is gone. And yet, the Beach Boys continue to tour. Under Mike Love's direction, the current lineup, featuring newer members and longtime collaborators, has bookings through the end of 2025. The Sound of Summer Tour, ironically named after a legacy Love once fought to protect, now carries the weight of a history he alone can narrate. But even as the lights stay on, questions linger. Who owns the Beach Boys now? Not just legally, but spiritually. For years, critics and fans alike have struggled with the duality of Mike Love's legacy. On one hand, he was the unmistakable voice behind some of the band's biggest hits. On the other, he's often portrayed as the commercial anchor that weighed down Brian's artistic ambition.
One is remembered as a genius who redefined pop, the other as a businessman who kept the records selling. And yet, without Mike Love, there would have been no touring Beach Boys after the 1970s, no preservation of the catalog, no exposure for younger generations. But he was never embraced as the guardian of the brand. He was tolerated, occasionally respected, rarely celebrated. Now, the future of the Beach Boys rests with two forces: the estate of Brian Wilson and the will of Mike Love. Rumors swirl about unreleased studio material, potential AI-driven performances, and even a new posthumous album curated from decades of unreleased demos. Some reports claim that Wilson's vault, once off-limits, is now under review by legal teams and surviving family members. Love, for his part, has said little. In recent interviews, he has shifted tone, not combative, not defensive, but wistful. He talks about childhood jams in living rooms, about convincing Brian to come to gigs, about what could have been if family hadn't become entangled with business. These aren't just memories, they're quiet attempts to rewrite the ending, not in facts, but in feeling. But the public hasn't forgotten the decades of division, and they haven't quite forgiven either. Some see Mike Love as a legacy keeper. Others see him as the last man rewriting history. Most see him as someone who no longer needs to explain himself because the story is over. And yet, he remains, touring, singing, standing beneath the banner of a band that will never be whole again. What happens next isn't just about music. It's about memory, control, and the legacy of America's most complex pop group. For over 60 years, the Beach Boys were a portrait of youth, sunshine, and harmony. Now, they're a memory carried forward by the only man left on stage, still performing, still polarizing, and still trying to find the final verse.